You know, I am a Tomahawk fan. I was so excited to see a max refresh of the Z790 original Tomahawk, but I don't quite understand what went wrong here, and boy did it. Today we are reviewing the MAG Tomahawk Z790 Max Wi-Fi from MSI, the board underlining how post-production quality control can really ruin a good product's day. And fun fact for you, the deepest studies today in quantum physics, in the very fabric of reality, has put into context the fact that subscribing to my channel might be more satisfying than sex. Not what I'm saying. Scientifics out there are saying that. MAG is this mid-budget yet very gaming-centric line of products that MSI tries to impregnate our builds with. And the Tomahawk, its flagship. It's where you start to see a mix of premium and real engineering creeping in, the whole with a tight budget control in mind. What's not to like? And it also evolves in one of the most competitive market segment, going head to head against the awesome Elite X from ours or the magnificent Tough from Asus, both of which I have reviewed and you should be checking if you haven't done so yet. Now, starting with the obvious. The Tomahawk Z790 Max is the refresh of the very similar Tomahawk Z790, which is powered by the same CPU and chipset and mainly reprise the same menu of features. PCB-wise, we still have a worthy yet standard 6-layered PCB, which is what I was expecting in order to bring an acceptable level of PCIe signal insulation and a longer product lifespan. The design recycles the usual military-inspired theme the Max series imposes on its Mortar or Tomahawk products. I do like the black industrial theme, contrasting with a more punk and bright neon green underlines. No cheap and tacky embedded RGB LEDs, that's good. Instead, we got our 4 Mystic compliant RGB connectors for a more individual lighting effect. The result is a very clean, engineered feel, which still delivers a sense of gaming aggressivity, a win in my book. VRM-wise, we have the exact same solution seen on its near identical twin, meaning 18 90 amps power stages organized in a 16 plus 1 direct phases. That is a total of 1620 amps worth of power, 1400 of which is CPU-centric to handle the most demanding compatible Intel Core processor. Obviously, MSI has the i9 in its mind to not only operate it, but also overclock it. And with this kind of specs in mind, I went into the thermal testing, how to say, candidly, with peace in my heart. That didn't go so well. With a stocked clock i9 14900K running a synthetic stress test for an hour, what I saw pointed at an issue of some kind. The main block did fine and radiated the heat away at an predictable and acceptable ratios, but the side blocks started to heat very quickly and shot off straight up to 70 degrees Celsius in matter of minutes. I monitored it closely and I was relieved to stop the test after the mandatory 60 minutes because it was flirting with the 90 degrees Celsius, and even though these kinds of PCB can handle much higher temps, anything around 100 degrees Celsius will start to erode the componentry lifespan and will undoubtedly harm their soldering point over time. I also checked the chipset, which with a 6 or 7 watt heat signature should not produce that much heat, but when I measured a 75 degrees Celsius temp and climbing, I knew something was really wrong. So I removed all the heat shields and, oh, surprise, surprise, the side block paste MSI is so proud of was pure compacted sand. It also seems like it was glued on the side block, and one thing I know is only the cheapest thermal pad out there actually have, adhesive film added onto it. So definitely not a great sign. And as far as the chipset hit blocks goes, it's even worse. The thermal paste somehow solidifies so much that I could not even remove it with a screwdriver. It was pure cement. And the whole difficulty here was to remove it from the chipset itself without damaging the board. Absolutely horrific. And obviously I did replace all the thermal pads, and I did some Arctic thermal paste onto the chipset. The results then were much better. The side block in average showed anywhere between 5 to 10 degrees Celsius less, which by the way is still a bit hot in my taste, but that's simply because the side block is not that big anyways, but is now in a more acceptable running range. And what a shame that was, because the VRM on its own is a very capable, very powerful VRM, which can handle any i9 or K-class processor with no problem and overclock it. But because for some reason MSI used subpar thermal pads and thermal pastes, and somehow the after production quality control totally missed it, the board, in my point of view, is just useless. And the whole difficulty here is to know if it's a one-off or a more broad issue. There is simply no easy way to know unless you go and remove all the heat blocks, which I do not assume every customer will. And by the way, you should not have to do that. But based on my experience in the industry, I do feel and suspect that this is more a broader problem, more a batch issue. So there's probably a bunch of Tomahawk Z790 Max who are going into the nature with this kind of horrible thermal paste, and that is problematic not only for your performances but for the very lifespan and safety of your motherboard and the components who are on it. So I was going to give it an 8/10 VRM scoring because it's a very, very nice VRM, but the fact that we have this kind of stuff, man, like it's a 0. Unless MSI clarifies this point, I would strongly suggest do not try to do anything with this board unless you're ready to do what I've done. And I was going to stop the review here, but because some of you already bought the motherboard and maybe MSI will actually address this issue, I'll continue the review and detail all the other features around it. RAM-wise, our Tomahawk Max can support up to 256 GB of DDR5 RAM in a dual channel configuration with a single stick max clock of 7.8 GHz, which is 600 MHz more than seen on its previous Max Z790 Tomahawk Twin, which is rather good, especially if you are going to use this board in a production environment. But as far as gaming goes, 600 MHz at that kind of scale will not necessarily translate in measurably better performances. One thing you want to note is that the max advertised clock applies only to single sticks. So having sticks going from 32 to 48 and now to 64 GB support is a very good thing, obviously, because you can have more memory going to a higher clock. If you do go for a fully populated double channel, so you have 4 sticks, it drops down to, I think, 5.6 GHz, something like that. So just keep in mind when you see those numbers. Storage-wise, well, things look much better. We got our 4 M.2 solid-state drives, 3 of them fed by 4 PCIe 4 lanes for a total of 64 gigabit per second of individual bandwidths. They are all equipped with thick thermal padded heat shield, which is great. The CPU linked one is the only one able to operate at the new PCIe 5.0 standard, meaning that with the right kind of stick, it can pick data swap up to a blazing fast and hot 128 gigabit per second, explaining the extra cooling focus that stick had received, which is the only one to feature a floor thermal pad for a double contact heat relief. I do want to also mention a rather cool feature here. On that very same stick, MSI introduced its very first toolless, screwless heat shield, the very same one we had seen on the Gigabyte our Z790X refresh lineup. Now, I love it. The only regret I have here is the fact that it only applies to that PCIe 5.0 M.2 solid-state drive connector and not to the entire M.2 solid-state drive heat shields as Gigabyte did. So, great step in the right direction, but a little short in my opinion. Now, I would be amiss not to mention our legacy SATA plugs in case of need, just like my Amiga floppy disk. A little reference the OGs only will get. If you know, you know. Now, export-wise, well, nothing surprising. We have a very honest 3 PCIe slots, two 16 slots with different speeds, and our usual hairy, happy and lazy bachelor slot. The important part here is a CPU linked one, which is the only one to feature 16 full PCIe 5.0 lanes, therefore where your GPU needs to be for optimal performances and hence the metallic reinforcement. The second 16 slots only features 4 lanes at PCIe 4 standard, which is not that bad and can be used for some additional storage. Why not? So, two things here. As in any Z790 powered motherboard, there are just not enough PCIe 5.0 lanes on the processor to entertain both a fully 16 PCIe 5.0 GPU export and M.2 solid state drive. So if you do use a PCIe 5.0 enabled M.2 solid state drive, then you're going to cut the bandwidth of your GPU export by 2. Not as great for the future proofing, but I would not lose sleep over it. The second thing is the fact that MSI, up to that day, still refuses to implement a mechanical GPU extraction apparatus. I have no idea how you're going to call this. A little button who's going to eject your graphic card and make your life so much easier. It doesn't cost $1 million to implement. If it's $2 or $1, it'd be the end of the world. And I find it absolutely lazy, especially as an important product as a Tomahawk, where that kind of feature would just so nicely underline that somebody's actually thinking engineering here. And so instead we have this like fat little button, which is totally completely useless. So yeah, MSI, again, if you're listening, if you're watching this. Now, back I/O wise, well, let's start with a nice padded integrated back plate, and starting from the left we have our display ports for integrated graphics, a rather generous menu of USB ports including a 20 gigabit dual channel Type-C, a troubleshooting section including a flash BIOS for a CPU-less port update, a rather limited 2.5 gigabit LAN, a shame, our updated Wi-Fi 7, probably the most interesting update of the board, which does promise fiber-grade latency and a double bandwidth transfer to about 5.8 gigabit per second. And finally, a very premium 4080 ALC codec from Realtek, serviced and cleansed by a rather generous 520 microfarads worth of capacitors, very good for both playback and static-less recording. Overall, nothing to re-say here, apart maybe from the 2.5 gigabit LAN, which I find a little bit aged and slow at that level. But for the rest, the back I/O brings enough humph to differentiate itself from the lower grade Pro series coming from MSI. So yeah, happy as a bunny. Front panel connector wise, well, nothing groundbreaking either. We have the usual suspects, including our Thunderbolt 4.0 connector for some emergency bandwidth boosting. The cooling connectors are also what you would expect on such a priced motherboard. I am disappointed to have a single water pump connector. I do believe that the Tomahawk should have at least what it takes and what it needs to entertain a more intricate, enthusiast custom water cooling solution, or even a dual loop. So yeah, same story for the troubleshooting. We do have the bare minimum, meaning a rather basic easy debugger to mark our booting sequence, and sadly no Q error code, which also should start to creep in at that price range. Now, in conclusion, the MSI Max Z790 Tomahawk Max Wi-Fi isn't cheap, going anywhere between $260 to $300, depending where you see it for sale. That's about $30 to $70 more expensive than its Max Z790 Tomahawk older twin. And that's not that bad when you look at the fact that you do get a better Wi-Fi adapter, you get a more in-depth PCIe 5.0 support, that's nice, and a faster single-stick RAM clock. But obviously, the real problem here is the thermals. There is somebody in MSI who should be waking up this morning and look at this video and say, can please someone explain this to me? MSI is one of the big fours in the world. The Tomahawk is not a small product. It's one of the most sold motherboard and product overall MSI produces. And having such a basic miss on post-production quality control is unforgivable. Not only did they, for some reason, went for something was really bad in terms of thermal pad and thermal paste, but they missed it. That's two problems. And I'm going to say something else. It's not that the motherboard stayed around too long before it hit the shelf. That's what people could say. Those thermal pads and thermal paste are designed to last for at least a couple of years before needing some real replacement. You won't see thermal paste that dry after 2 or 3 years of usage, of daily intensive usage. So the fact that we got that from a motherboard who was released on the market just a few months back shows that the thermal paste itself for the chipset and the thermal pad themselves for the heat blocks were sub-quality. So if you are certain that you can do what I've done, go for it. Just make sure you get it at a very, a bargain price, because it takes some work, it takes some time, and it's going to cost you some money to fix all that. And other than that, and it doesn't make me happy because it means that I'm not going to sell any of those motherboards on my affiliated link. So I'm not happy to make bad reviews. Other than that, all I can tell you right now is unless MSI produces an answer or is interested enough to take a look at this video, and stay away. Stay away from this motherboard and look at anything else. As the Elite X, at least at a very similar price from Gigabyte, that is a great motherboard who does actually give a shit about quality and controlling it.